Welcome to my channel.
The wind howled around the small police station in Lochdubh like a banshee mourning a particularly beloved relative. It was a vicious, biting Highland wind, the kind that found its way through the smallest cracks in window frames and sent drafts snaking along the floorboards to freeze the ankles. Inside, however, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was a portrait of contented insulation. The pot-bellied stove was glowing cherry red, emitting a fierce heat that battled the drafts to a standstill. Hamish was slumped deep in his battered armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the warmth, a chipped mug filled with coffee, generously fortified with a splash of something amber that hadn't paid duty, cradled in his large hands. At his feet, Lugs, a small, nondescript mongrel of dubious lineage and cynical temperament, was twitching in his sleep, chasing dream rabbits across a sun-drenched moor that existed only in his mind. It was Christmas Eve. More importantly, it was nearly midnight on Christmas Eve. The rest of the village was currently shivering its way through the watch-night service at the kirk down the road, wishing the Reverend Wellington would hurry up and deliver the baby Jesus so they could all go home to their beds. Hamish, being the sole representative of law and order in a vast, desolate stretch of Sutherland, had excused himself on the grounds of maintaining vigilance. Vigilance, in Hamish's vocabulary, meant hoping desperately that the telephone would not ring. A call on Christmas Eve usually meant trouble from Strathbane headquarters, involving drunken brawls in distant fishing ports or sheep straying onto the A9. Hamish took a noisy slurp of his spiked coffee. He had a fine haunch of venison, acquired through a transaction with a gentleman whose definition of property rights was flexible, marinating for his Christmas dinner tomorrow. He had warmth. He had silence. He was, for the moment, a happy man. He closed his eyes, his flaming red hair flopping over his forehead, and allowed himself to drift into a light doze. The peace was shattered not by the telephone, but by a sound entirely alien to Lochdubh at this hour. It was the roar of a high-performance engine, too throaty for a tractor, too arrogant for a local's aging Vauxhall. It snarled down the waterfront road, gears crunching violently, before screeching to a halt somewhere near the Lochdubh Hotel. Lugs woke with a snort, lifting his head to glare accusingly at the door. "Oh, relax, ye beast," Hamish muttered, though he opened one hazel eye. Probably just Archie McLean trying to impress the barmaid with his exhaust pipe again, but he knew it wasn't Archie. The engine cut out, followed immediately by the loud slam of a heavy car door and a voice raised in the unmistakable braying tones of an affluent Sassenach. The sound carried sharply on the icy wind. "Is this it? Good God, it's like the backside of nowhere." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that seemed to originate from his very boots. The coffee mug was reluctantly lowered. The warmth of the stove suddenly seemed less protective. An outsider shouting on Christmas Eve was like a lone magpie. It bode ill. With a groan of genuine effort, Hamish unfolded his lanky frame from the chair. He threw on his greatcoat, jammed his peaked cap onto his head, instantly making him look less like a lazy Highlander and more like a very tall, slightly dishevelled figure of authority, and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind immediately slapped his face with a wet, icy glove. He hunched his shoulders and stalked toward the hotel, Lugs trotting reluctantly at his heels. Parked haphazardly across two spaces in front of the hotel was a Range Rover, not a mud-spattered working vehicle like the local farmers used, but a pristine, aggressive machine painted a shade of metallic black that looked expensive and out of place against the humble, whitewashed stone of the village. Hamish pushed open the door to the hotel bar. The warmth inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, damp wool and peat smoke. Because of the church service, the bar was quieter than usual, tenanted only by a few hardened atheists and Mr. Johnson, the long-suffering manager, who was polishing a glass with the air of a man contemplating murder. All eyes were fixed on the newcomer leaning against the bar. He was a man in his late 40s wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than Hamish's annual salary. He had the sort of sleek, well-fed face that suggested a lifetime of expensive lunches and having his own way, currently flushed with drink and irritation. Don't care what time it is, the man was barking at Mr. Johnson, slapping a platinum credit card onto the mahogany counter. "I booked the suite and I expect a bottle of decent champagne in it. Not that fizzy vinegar you probably serve the locals." Mr. Johnson, whose patience was legendary, looked ready to snap. "As I explained, sir, the kitchen is closed and the cellar is locked for the night. It is Christmas Eve, and I am Marcus Pemberton," the man announced, as if this explained everything. I've just bought the Glencera estate. I own half the view from this miserable little window." Hamish drifted toward the bar, adopting his preferred persona for dealing with the gentry, the slow-witted country policeman. He leaned against a support beam, looking vaguely vacant. Pemberton spun around, sensing a new presence. His eyes swept over Hamish's height, his slightly ill-fitting uniform, and his general air of lassitude. He snorted dismissively. "And what do you want, officer?" Pemberton squinted at Hamish's shoulder number. "Macbeth, sir. PC Macbeth," Hamish said in a soft, lilting Highland voice that gave nothing away. "Just checking everything is in order. A bit loud outside, sir. Disturbing the peace on a holy night." Pemberton laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Peace? It's the peace of the grave out there. I'm just trying to get some service in this backwater. You people move like you're wading through treacle." He turned back to Johnson. "My key. Now. And if I don't get champagne, I'll be having a very serious talk with the licensing board in Strathbane about this establishment." Mr. Johnson, pale with suppressed rage, slammed a heavy brass key onto the counter. Pemberton snatched it up. He glared once more at Hamish. "Don't just stand there, man. Don't you have some sheep to bother?" Hamish merely blinked, his face a mask of bovine incomprehension. "Merry Christmas to you too, sir," he said mildly. Pemberton muttered an obscenity about the Scottish character, pulled his cashmere coat tighter around him, and stalked out of the bar toward the guest wing, leaving a wake of expensive cologne and intense dislike behind him. The silence in the bar stretched until the heavy oak door banged shut. "Nice chap," muttered one of the atheists by the fire. "He's bought Glencera." Mr. Johnson looked stricken. "That's old Mrs. MacGregor's land. He'll be wanting to build those dreadful timeshare chalets, mark my words." Hamish stared at the closed door. His brain, usually content to idle in neutral, was beginning to tick over. Men like Marcus Pemberton didn't come to Lochdubh in the dead of winter just for the scenery. They came to take things, change things, and ruin things. "Aye, well," Hamish said, pushing himself off the beam. "He'll find the winter here long enough if he keeps making friends at that speed." He nodded to Mr. Johnson and headed back out into the biting wind. He needed to get back to his stove and his whiskey, but as he walked the short distance to the police station, a sense of deep unease settled over him, colder than the snow that was just beginning to fall. The outsider had arrived, and Hamish knew with a sinking heart that his quiet Christmas was officially over. The following morning, Christmas Day dawned with a deceptive innocence. The storm had passed, leaving Lochdubh blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow that hid the sheep droppings and softened the jagged edges of the mountains. Inside the police house, the air was thick with the rich, gamey aroma of roasting venison. Hamish had been up since 6, basting the meat with a mixture of red currant jelly and port, humming a tune that sounded vaguely like a hymn but was actually an old drinking song. He had laid the table for one, placing a cracker next to his plate and treating lugs to a large raw bone that was currently being gnawed on the hearthrug with enthusiastic wet noises. Hamish lifted the lid of the roasting pan, inhaled deeply, and smiled. It was perfect. Another hour, and he would be feasting. He reached for the kettle to make a pot of tea to tide him over, congratulating himself on a peaceful morning. The telephone on the wall rang. It was a shrill mechanical scream that cut through the cosy atmosphere like a knife. Hamish froze, the kettle suspended in mid-air. He glared at the instrument. He willed it to stop. He bargained silently with the Almighty, promising to attend church next Sunday if only the caller would give up. The phone rang again, insistent and demanding. With a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire body, Hamish trudged over and snatched up the receiver. "Lochdubh Police," he said, his voice heavy with doom. "Hamish, you have to come at once." The voice was high, breathy, and bordering on hysteria. It was Mr. Johnson from the hotel. "Mr. Johnson, it is Christmas morning," Hamish said reasonably. "Unless the hotel is on fire, surely it can wait until—" "He's dead, Hamish. He's dead. Stark, staring dead in the garden." Hamish felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach, the heavy stone of duty that crushed all hopes of a hot lunch. "Who is dead?" "That man. The rude one. Pemberton. Oh, it's awful, Hamish. It's simply awful. And the guests are waking up." "Touch nothing," Hamish commanded, his voice sharpening. "And keep everyone away. I'll be there in 5. Innits." He slammed the phone down and looked mournfully at the oven. He turned the dial down to low, hoping against hope that the meat wouldn't dry out into shoe leather, and whistled for lugs. The dog looked up from his bone, giving Hamish a look of betrayal that mirrored the constable's own feelings perfectly. The walk to the hotel was trudged in gloomy silence. The village was waking up, smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of excited children filtered through the frosty air. It all seemed terribly unfair. When Hamish arrived at the Lochdubh Hotel, he found Mr. Johnson standing by the side gate that led to the ornamental garden, shivering violently in a cardigan that was far too thin for the weather. His face was the colour of old porridge. "In there," Johnson squeaked, pointing a shaking finger toward the centre of the lawn. "I went out to check the generator because the power dipped, and I saw him." Hamish pushed past the manager and stepped into the garden. The hotel usually made an effort for Christmas, which meant filling the perfectly good Highland landscape with tacky plastic decorations ordered from a catalogue. In the centre of the lawn sat a large plywood sleigh painted a garish red, intended for children to pose in for photographs. Occupying the sleigh, however, was not Santa Claus, but Marcus Pemberton. The wealthy developer was slumped sideways against the plywood seat, his legs sprawling awkwardly over the side. The expensive cashmere coat was still buttoned tight, but his face was a mottled, dusky purple. Whatever dignity his money had bought him in life had completely vanished in death. A string of heavy-duty outdoor fairy lights, the ones meant to twinkle festively around the reindeer, was wrapped tightly, viciously around his neck. Hamish approached slowly, his boots crunching softly on the snow. He didn't rush, he didn't gasp, he merely stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, observing. Lugs sniffed the air tentatively and gave a low whine, the fur on his neck bristling. "Nasty way to go," Hamish murmured to the dog. He stepped closer, careful where he placed his feet. Pemberton's eyes were bulging, staring sightlessly at the grey sky. His tongue protruded slightly, but it wasn't the gruesome face that held Hamish's attention. It was the snow. Fresh snow had fallen heavily until about 4 a.m. The body had a light dusting on the shoulders of the coat, but the snow around the sleigh was trampled, not by many feet, but by a few. The struggle had been brief. "Mr. Johnson," Hamish called out without turning around. "Yes, Hamish?" The manager was hovering by the gate, looking like he might be sick. "Who else has been out here?" "No one." "I saw him, screamed, and ran back to call you. I didn't go near him." Hamish narrowed his eyes. There were footprints leading to the sleigh, and footprints leading away, disappearing toward the back of the hotel where the staff quarters and the kitchen entrance were located. But there was something else. On the trampled snow near the body, lying half buried, was a small, vibrant splash of colour. Hamish bent down, squinting. It looked like a feather, a small, bright orange feather, the kind used in fishing lures, or perhaps a very flamboyant hat. He straightened up, his mind racing. Pemberton had been strangled with Christmas lights in a fake sleigh. It was theatrical. It was personal. It was exactly the sort of crime that would bring the wrath of God down upon Lochdubh in the form of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "Right," Hamish said, the resignation in his voice profound. "Mr. Johnson, lock the garden gate. I need to use your phone to call Strathbane. And for heaven's sake, don't let the guests look out the windows." As he turned back toward the hotel, Hamish felt a pang of hunger. He knew, with absolute certainty, that by the time the detectives arrived, shouted at him, and took over the scene, his venison would be ruined. And for that, more than the murder itself, he decided he was going to catch whoever did this. The wait for the Strathbane police was a cold and solitary vigil that tested even Hamish Macbeth's legendary capacity for doing absolutely nothing. He stood by the garish red sleigh, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his greatcoat, stamping his boots occasionally to keep the circulation flowing to his toes. Lugs, having decided that loyalty had its limits when the temperature dropped below freezing, had long since abandoned him to whine at the hotel's back door until a sympathetic kitchen maid let him in. Hamish was left alone with the corpse of Marcus Pemberton, the Christmas lights, and the growing certainty that his venison was by now reduced to a dry, blackened cinder. From the hotel windows, faces appeared and disappeared like ghostly fish in an aquarium. The guests, initially terrified by Mr. Johnson's shrieks, were now consumed by a morbid curiosity. Hamish could see the distinct silhouette of a woman in a silk dressing gown pressing a pair of opera glasses against the glass of the second-floor suite. The village, too, was stirring. News of a death travelled through Lochdubh faster than a virus, carried on the wind and the telephone wires. Already, small knots of villagers were gathering at the edge of the hotel grounds, whispering behind gloved hands and pointing at the police constable who stood guard over the Sassenach. It was nearly an hour later when the peace of the glen was shattered for the second time in 24 hours. A convoy of 3 police cars, sirens wailing unnecessarily on the empty roads, roared into the hotel driveway, skidding slightly on the packed snow before coming to a chaotic halt. Doors flew open, and the silence was instantly colonized by the heavy, aggressive presence of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair was a man who carried his own atmosphere of stress and indigestion wherever he went. He was short, squat, and possessed a face the colour of raw beef, currently turned a deeper shade of violet by the twin furies of the cold wind and having to work on a holiday. He heaved himself out of the lead car, buttoning a coat that strained dangerously across his midriff, followed closely by his 2 sycophantic shadows, Detectives Anderson and Macnab. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "Where is he? Where is the body? And why are you standing there like a stuffed owl while a murderer runs loose?" Hamish touched the peak of his cap in a slow, languid salute that he knew infuriated his superior. "He is right here in the sleigh, sir, just as I found him. I haven't touched a thing." Blair stomped across the lawn, his heavy brogues obliterating the delicate trail of footprints Hamish had carefully avoided. Hamish winced internally but said nothing. To point out the destruction of evidence would only result in a reprimand for insubordination. To let Blair destroy it was merely the natural order of things. Anderson and Macnab trailed behind, pulling out notebooks and cameras, looking important and entirely useless. Blair stopped at the sleigh and stared down at the strangled man. He sniffed loudly, a sound of supreme disgust. Strangled with fairy lights, he grunted. Messy, theatrical, looks like the work of a maniac. Or a woman. He turned his small piggy eyes onto Hamish. "Who found him?" "Mr. Johnson, the manager, sir, about an hour ago." "And who is this Pemberton character?" "Local?" "No, sir. He arrived last night, bought the Glensyra estate. He was not well liked, sir. Had a bit of a disagreement with the staff and the locals in the bar." Blair sneered. "A disagreement?" "Someone doesn't get strangled with Christmas decorations over a disagreement, Macbeth. This is passion, or robbery." He leaned over the body, his gloved hands patting down the dead man's pockets with rough impatience. "Wallet's gone, watch is gone. There you have it. A robbery gone wrong. Some local Ned saw a rich Englishman flashing his cash and decided to help himself." Hamish cleared his throat softly. "I believe his watch is still on his left wrist, sir, under the cuff, and the wallet is likely in his inside pocket, which is buttoned up." Blair froze, then turned slowly to glare at Hamish. "Are you telling me how to do my job, Constable? I said it looks like robbery. If the valuables are there, then the killer panicked. It doesn't change the motive." He straightened up, dismissing the logic with a wave of his hand. "Right, I want everyone in this hotel questioned. Staff first, especially anyone with a record. You have plenty of those types up here, don't you? Poachers, petty thieves, sheep stealers." "There is Gavin the porter," Anderson piped up, eager to be helpful. "He did time for burglary in Inverness 2 years ago, didn't he, sir?" "Get him," Blair barked, "and drag the manager out here. I want to know who had access to this garden." As the detectives scurried off to terrorize the hotel staff, Blair turned back to Hamish, his expression one of pure loathing. "And you, Macbeth, you've done enough standing around. You're useless at a crime scene. You hover like a bad smell. Get out to the road. Manage the traffic. If the press sniff this out, I don't want them swarming over the lawn before I've solved it. And get that mangy dog of yours out of the hotel kitchen, or I'll have it impounded." Hamish's expression remained perfectly vacant. "Right you are, sir. Traffic control. Leave it to me." He turned and began the long walk back toward the road. His shoulders slumped in apparent dejection for Blair's benefit. But as soon as he was out of earshot, a faint, cunning smile touched his lips. Blair had already decided on the narrative, a panicked robbery by a local delinquent. He had trampled the snow, ignored the orange feather, and failed to ask why a man would be sitting in a child's sleigh in the middle of the night in the first place. Hamish reached the gate, but instead of taking up a post on the road, he slipped quietly around the side of the perimeter wall. He wasn't going to direct traffic. There was no traffic. Everyone was at home eating turkey. He was going to circle back to the kitchen entrance. He needed to rescue Lugs, but more importantly, he needed to have a quiet word with the kitchen staff before Blair's bullies terrified them into silence. The investigation, Hamish decided as he checked to ensure the coast was clear, was just beginning, and it would be conducted over a pot of tea, not a notepad. The warmth of the hotel kitchen hit Hamish like a physical blow, a stifling, humid wall of roasting turkey, boiling Brussels sprouts and high-octane anxiety. It was a chaotic contrast to the frozen, monochrome silence of the garden where Marcus Pemberton lay strangled. Yet Hamish found it infinitely more welcoming. He slipped through the back door, closing it softly against the draught, and immediately spotted Lugs. The dog was currently lying under the central prep table, looking fat and treacherous, having clearly sold his loyalty for a string of cocktail sausages that Mrs. MacTaggart, the hotel's formidable cook, had accidentally dropped on the floor. Hamish unbuttoned his heavy greatcoat and leaned against the stainless steel counter, adopting the posture of a man who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. Mrs. MacTaggart was red-faced, wrestling a gargantuan turkey out of the industrial oven while barking orders at a terrified teenage scullery maid who was dropping silverware in sheer panic. When the cook saw Hamish, her expression softened only fractionally, shifting from homicidal rage to a familiar, weary exasperation. "I suppose you'll be wanting tea," she said, not looking at him but jerking her chin toward the massive, silver urn bubbling in the corner. "And don't think I don't see that beast of yours tripping me up every time I turn around. He's a menace to health and safety. He's guarding the perimeter against further intrusions," Hamish lied smoothly, moving toward the urn with the speed of a striking cobra. He poured a mug of tea, dark, tannic, and scalding hot, and liberated a fresh crumbling mince pie from a cooling rack before anyone could object. "And I am merely conducting inquiries in a strategic location. The chief inspector is a busy man. I wouldn't want to get under his feet and disrupt his important work." "That little shouting man!" Mrs. MacTaggart snorted derisively, slamming the turkey onto a carving board with enough force to rattle the pans hanging from the ceiling. "He's in the manager's office now," screaming at poor Gavin until the lad's nearly in tears. "Accusing him of stealing a wallet. Gavin wouldn't steal a sugar lump, and you know it, Hamish." The boy is terrified of his own shadow. Hamish blew on his tea, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully over the rim of the chipped mug. "Aye, well, Blair likes a quick solution. It saves him having to think too hard. But tell me, Mrs. MacTaggart, you were here late last night finishing the prep. Did Mr. Pemberton have any visitors before he decided to sit in the sleigh?" Mrs. MacTaggart wiped her grease-stained hands on her apron. "He did. Room service. Ordered a bottle of Bollinger at midnight, the demands of the man. Gavin took it up, said Pemberton was in a foul mood, pacing the room like a caged tiger and shouting into his mobile phone. Alone? He was then. But," she lowered her voice, leaning in conspiratorially over the carcass of the bird, "Isla, the chambermaid, saw her leaving his room about half an hour later, just before the shouting started outside in the car park." Hamish paused, the mince pie hovering halfway to his mouth. "Her?" "The blonde one," Mrs. MacTaggart whispered, her eyes darting to the door to ensure they were alone. "The one in the royal suite. Mrs. Bartlett. Arrived yesterday afternoon, all furs and jewellery, looking down her nose at everyone like she was the Queen of Sheba. Isla said she came. Storming out of Pemberton's room looking like she wanted to kill someone, and she was crying. Aye. Mascara running down her face, a proper mess. And she was missing her hat." Hamish felt a little jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the caffeine or the sugar. "What kind of hat?" "Oh, a ridiculous thing," piped up Isla, who had emerged from the scullery with a tray of dirty glasses, having gathered the courage to speak. She was a small, timid girl with eyes wide with excitement. "I saw it when she checked in, Mr. Macbeth. It was a felt thing, expensive looking, I'm sure, but it had these massive feathers on it. Bright orange ones, like a giant fishing fly." Hamish chewed his mince pie slowly, savouring the pastry and the information equally. An orange feather, a crying woman, a missing hat. It was a picture that was starting to make a lot more sense than Blair's theory of a robbery gone wrong. If Mrs. Bartlett had lost her hat during a struggle, or perhaps thrown it in a fit of rage, and a feather had come loose near the sleigh. It placed her directly at the scene of the crime. "Did Gavin tell the Chief Inspector about Mrs. Bartlett?" Hamish asked quietly. Mrs. MacTaggart shook her head vigorously. "The poor lad hasn't had a chance to speak a word. That Detective Anderson just keeps asking him where he hid the money and checking his pockets." "They aren't asking about women. They've decided it's a burglary committed by the staff." "Good," Hamish said, draining his mug and brushing the crumbs from his uniform. "Let them keep thinking that. It keeps them occupied." He looked down at Lugs. "Come on, you traitor. We have work to do." Lugs groaned but scrambled up, claws clicking on the tile, sensing that the supply of sausages had finally dried up. Hamish buttoned his coat, his mind racing. He needed to find out who Mrs. Bartlett was and, more importantly, what her connection was to Marcus Pemberton. If she was in the suite, she was wealthy. If she was, crying leaving Pemberton's room, she was emotional. And if she was strong enough to strangle a man with a string of Christmas lights, she was dangerous. "Save a slice of that turkey for me, Mrs. MacTaggart," Hamish called over his shoulder as he pushed open the back door. "Away with you, Hamish Macbeth. You'll get nothing but bones," she shouted after him, but there was a distinct smile on her face. Hamish stepped back out into the cold. The wind had picked up again, swirling the powdery snow into little devils that danced across the yard. He could hear Blair's voice booming from the front of the hotel, still haranguing the staff. Hamish turned his collar up against the chill and headed not toward the road to direct traffic, but around the side of the building, his eyes fixed on the windows of the second floor. He needed to see this Mrs. Bartlett. But first, he needed to make himself invisible, something at which he was an expert. He began to trudge through the deep snow toward the village post office. If anyone knew the background of a flashy female visitor, it would be the postmistress. She read all the postcards, listened to the calls, and knew the secrets of Lochdubh before the sinners had even committed them. The investigation was moving from the stomach to the grapevine. The village general store and post office run by the formidable Mrs. Macrum was officially closed for the holiday. However, in Lochdubh, closed was a concept as flexible as the local interpretation of licensing laws. Hamish knew that Mrs. Macrum would be in the back room, ostensibly organising the inventory, but in reality waiting by her scanner to intercept police radio frequencies. He knocked on the frosted glass of the door. 2 sharp raps, a pause, and a heavy thump, a code known only to the locals who had run out of milk, whiskey, or patience. After a moment, the bolt slid back with a screech of protest. Mrs. Macrum peered out, her grey hair encased in a net that looked capable of trapping. A small shark. Her eyes, usually hard as flint, glittered with the suppressed excitement of bad news. "Hamish Macbeth," she hissed, ushering him in and slamming the door quickly against the wind. "I knew you'd come. Is it true? Is the Englishman died? They say he was strangled with tinsel." "It was fairy lights, actually," Hamish corrected, moving instinctively toward the pot of tea that was steaming on the counter next to a plate of shortbread. He looked at the biscuits with the pathetic, wide-eyed longing of a starving orphan. Mrs. Macrum, distracted by the scandal, pushed the plate toward him. "Fairy lights!" She clapped a hand to her chest. The wickedness of it. And on the Lord's birthday. Who did it? Have you arrested that poor Gavin yet? "I heard the sirens from Strathbane. That awful man Blair is shouting loud enough to be heard in Plockton." Hamish dunked a piece of shortbread into the tea, allowing the buttery crumbs to dissolve on his tongue. "Blair thinks it's a robbery," he said through a mouthful. "But I'm not so sure. I'm looking for a woman. A blonde woman, flashy. Might have been in here yesterday." Mrs. Macrum's eyes narrowed. "The one in the fur coat? Came in for cigarettes. Slim ones. Nasty things. She looked like she'd smelled something rotten, and I suspect it was just the village air." "Did she have a hat?" Hamish asked innocently. "She did. A ridiculous thing. Felt. With great orange feathers sticking out like she was trying to catch trout. Nearly took my eye out when she turned around to complain about the price of the matches. Said she was Mrs. Bartlett." "Bartlett," Hamish repeated, filing the name away. "Did she say what she was doing here?" "She asked where the Glensira estate was. Said she had a prior claim to inspect it." She sounded angry, Hamish. Bitter. Before Hamish could probe further, the shop bell jangled violently. Hamish stiffened. He was in no mood for more tourists, but as the door opened, the scent of expensive perfume cut. Through the aroma of paraffin and damp wool, It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She stood in the doorway shaking snow from a cashmere scarf that matched her eyes. She looked cool, elegant, and entirely out of place among the tins of baked beans and dusty postcards. As always, the sight of her caused Hamish a confused mixture of adoration and defensive prickly heat. She was the daughter of the local colonel, wealthy, educated, and everything Hamish told himself he didn't want, even though his heart argued otherwise. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and amused. "I might have guessed I'd find you here." "Avoiding actual police work?" "Gathering intelligence," Hamish said, straightening up and trying to hide the half-eaten shortbread behind his back. "And ensuring the security of the commercial district." Priscilla smiled, a gesture that did strange things to Hamish's knees. "I came for milk. Daddy has decided he wants a latte, and we're out. But I assume you're investigating the Pemberton murder." Mrs. Mac Crum gasped. "You know him, Miss Priscilla?" "I know of him," Priscilla said, stepping to the counter and laying a coin down for the milk. "Daddy served on a board with him in London once. Marcus Pemberton, a property developer with the morals of a barracuda. He specialised in buying up charm and concreting over it." Hamish watched her. "Did he have a partner, a woman?" Priscilla frowned thoughtfully. "He had many women, Hamish. He wasn't exactly known for his fidelity. But business partners... Wait. There was a Sheila Bartlett, an interior designer. They did a massive hotel conversion in the Cotswolds that went bankrupt. Rumour had it she lost a fortune, and he walked away with the assets." "Sheila Bartlett," Hamish murmured. "Blonde? Likes orange feathers?" Priscilla laughed. "That sounds like Sheila. She has theatrical taste. Why, is she here?" "She is at the hotel," Hamish said, "and she was seen leaving Pemberton's room in tears shortly before he ended up in the sleigh." Priscilla raised an eyebrow. "Well, there you are. A woman scorned and financially ruined to boot. That's a powerful cocktail, Hamish. Much more volatile than robbery." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "But surely DCI Blair has figured this out? He is the detective chief inspector, after all. Blair is currently arresting the porter for looking shifty," Hamish said dryly. "He doesn't know about the woman, and if I tell him, he'll just shout at me for interfering." "So you're going to solve it yourself," Priscilla concluded. "Again." "I am merely mooching," Hamish protested. "Listening to what people say." "Well," Priscilla said, picking up her milk, "if it is Sheila Bartlett, be careful, Hamish. She's not just theatrical, she's volatile. I remember hearing she threw a vase at a waiter in the Savoy because the soup was cold." Strangling Marcus with fairy light sounds exactly like her style of interior decoration. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Hamish, you have crumbs on your uniform. Do try to look professional. It worries the tourists." With a final dazzling smile, she swept out into the snow, leaving the shop feeling suddenly dimmer and much smaller. Hamish brushed the crumbs from his tunic, his face burning. Mrs. Mac Crum was watching him with a knowing smirk. "She's out of your league, Hamish," she said brutally. "I know that," Hamish snapped, the sting of truth sharper than the winter wind. "Now, did this Mrs. Bartlett mention anything else? Did she say where she was going next?" "She asked about the train times," Mrs. Mac Crum said, sensing his mood and offering the nugget of information as a peace offering. "Said she needed to be back in London by Boxing Day. If she did it, Hamish, she's planning to run." Hamish buttoned his coat. He had the name, he had the motive, and thanks to Priscilla, he had the confirmation of the suspect's temper. Blair was chasing a shadow in the servants' quarters, but the real Storm was sitting in the royal suite, packing her bags. "Put the shortbread on my tab," Hamish said, pulling his cap down low. "You don't have a tab," Mrs. Mac Crum shouted as he opened the door. "Start one," Hamish called back, stepping out into the swirling white. He needed to get back to the hotel. The mooching phase was over. It was time to set a trap, and he knew exactly how to bait it. He just hoped Lugs hadn't eaten any crucial evidence in his absence. The trudge back to the Lochdubh hotel was a battle against a wind that seemed to have taken the murder personally, whipping the snow into blinding sheets that stung the eyes and numbed the face. Hamish Macbeth kept his head down, his greatcoat flapping around his ankles like the wings of a grounded crow. Inside his mind, however, the gears were turning with a silent, frictionless precision that would have astonished DCI Blair. He had the pieces of the puzzle: a ruined woman, a missing hat, a feather, and a motive thick with financial betrayal. But pieces were not proof. He needed a reaction. He needed fear. When he pushed through the heavy front doors of the hotel, the warmth of the lobby enveloped him, carrying with it the sounds of a police operation rapidly descending into farce. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was standing in the center of the reception area, his face a alarming shade of puce, bellowing at a terrified Gavin the porter. "Don't lie to me, you miserable little worm," Blair shouted, spraying spittle. "You took up the champagne. You saw the wallet. You thought, here's a drunk Englishman, easy pickings. And when he woke up, you panicked. I didn't, I swear," Gavin wailed, wringing his hands. "I left the bottle outside the door. He shouted at me to leave it." Hamish drifted past the tableau, making himself as flat and inconspicuous as the wallpaper. He caught the eye of Detective Anderson, who was leaning against the desk, looking bored. Anderson rolled his eyes toward Blair, a silent communication of long-suffering solidarity. But Hamish didn't stop. He gave a vague, sleepy nod and slipped into the corridor leading to the residence lounge. The lounge was a sanctuary of faded Victorian gentility, smelling of beeswax, wood smoke, and dust. A large fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the velvet armchairs. The room appeared empty at first glance, but as Hamish moved further in, he saw the top of a blonde head resting against the back of a high wingback chair positioned near the window. He approached softly, his rubber-soled boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug. "Mrs. Bartlett?" he said softly. The woman jumped, her hand jerking so violently that the amber liquid in her glass splashed onto her wrist. She spun around, eyes wide and rimmed with red. She was a striking woman, even with her makeup smudged and her face pale with shock. She wore a heavy cream sweater and trousers that looked tailored, but her hands were trembling. "You startled me," she snapped, recovering her composure with a visible effort. She looked him up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs and the general air of disarray. "Who are you?" "The gardener." "Police Constable Macbeth," Hamish said, removing his cap and tucking it under his arm. He adopted his most non-threatening bovine expression. "Terrible business, this. Just making the rounds, checking on the guests. A sad Christmas for everyone." Sheila Bartlett relaxed slightly, clearly deciding that this rustic policeman was no threat compared to the shouting man in the lobby. "It is dreadful," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "I barely knew the man, of course. We met once or twice in London. But to have this happen, it's barbaric." "Aye, barbaric," Hamish agreed, moving to warm his hands by the fire. "And the chief inspector is quite certain he has his man, young Gavin, the porter. A local lad. Always been a bit shiftless, you know." "Oh?" A flicker of relief crossed Sheila's face. "Sharp and unmistakable. Well, that's efficient. I suppose these local boys get desperate for money." "That they do," Hamish sighed. "And Gavin has a record. It looks like an open and shut case. Robbery." He paused, watching the firelight dance on the brass fender. "Although there are a few things bothering me. Little things. The sort of things the big detectives from the city don't notice." Sheila's hand tightened on her glass. "What sort of things?" Hamish turned to look at her, his hazel eyes wide and guileless. "Well, the snow mostly. You see, Gavin has big feet, size 12 boots, clodhoppers we call them. But the footprints around the sleigh, they were small, delicately made, like a woman's." The colour drained from Sheila Bartlett's face, leaving it the colour of the snow outside. Perhaps a guest walked there earlier? "Maybe," Hamish conceded. "But then there's the matter of the feather. A bright orange feather. Found it right next to the poor man's hand. It looked like he might have grabbed it in the struggle. The inspector missed it. He was too busy shouting. But I picked it up. It's a very distinctive shade of orange. I was thinking I'd have to ask all the ladies in the hotel if they've lost a hat decoration." The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. The log in the fire shifted with a pop that sounded like a gunshot. Sheila Bartlett set her glass down on the small table. Her movements were stiff, mechanical. "A feather?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Aye. Bright orange. Ostrich, I think," Hamish said helpfully. "I've put it in my pocket for safekeeping. I haven't shown it to the chief inspector yet. He doesn't like me complicating his theories. He wants to arrest Gavin and be home for his pudding." He watched her carefully. The trap was baited. He had offered her a lifeline, Blair's incompetence, while simultaneously dangling the noose. If she was innocent, she would be puzzled. If she was guilty, she would be. Calculating, Sheila stood up. She smoothed her sweater, her eyes darting toward the door. I think I need to go to my room. I have a headache. The shock. Of course, Mrs. Bartlett, Hamish said, stepping aside. You rest. I'll just be here, keeping the feather safe until I decide what to do with it. She hurried past him, leaving a scent of expensive musk and fear in her wake. Hamish watched her go, his eyes losing their dreamy vacancy and sharpening into flint. He waited until her footsteps faded down the hall, then pulled the orange feather from his pocket and twirled it slowly in the firelight. She hadn't denied owning an orange hat. She hadn't asked to see the feather. She had run. And Hamish knew, as surely as he knew the sun would set over the loch, that she wasn't going to her room to sleep. She was going to try to destroy the evidence he claimed to have, or perhaps find the rest of the hat before he did. Right then, lugs, Hamish muttered to the empty room, though the dog was still absent. The game is afoot, and I suspect she's about to lead us straight to the rest of the bird. Hamish stepped out of the lounge and into the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt final. The encounter with Sheila Bartlett had been brief, but the scent of her fear was as palpable to him as the wood smoke clinging to his own uniform. He knew the type. She was a woman who had built a fortress of elegance around herself, a barrier of cashmere and indifference, but Marcus Pemberton had found a loose brick and pulled the whole thing down. Now she was scrambling in the rubble, desperate to hide the dust. He drifted into the reception area, moving with the deceptive slowness of a cloud shadow crossing a hillside. The atmosphere had changed. The panic of the early morning had curdled into a sullen resentment among the staff, while the police activity had reached a fever pitch of misguided triumph. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was standing by the main desk, looking like a man who had just won a difficult wrestle with a greased pig. He was wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, his face glowing with the exertion of shouting. "Macbeth!" Blair barked, spotting Hamish's lanky figure attempting to sidle past toward the exit. "Stop skulking. You can call off your traffic control. We've cracked it." The boy cracked. Hamish paused, arranging his features into a mask of polite admiration.
"Gavin, sir? He confessed to the murder? He confessed to the theft?"
Blair crowed, jabbing a thick finger into the air. Admitted he took the champagne bottle away before Pemberton was finished with it, said he wanted to save it from going to waste. A thief, Macbeth. And a thief caught in the act becomes a killer when panic sets in. I've sent Anderson to charge him. We'll have a full statement by tea time. That is very swift work, sir, Hamish said mildly, but did he explain the fairy lights? Or why he wrapped them so neatly? It seems a fiddly job for a panicked lad with shaking hands. Blair's triumph faltered for a second, replaced by his usual crimson fury. Don't try to be clever, Macbeth. It doesn't suit you. Murder is a messy business. It doesn't follow a script. The boy did it. Now get out of my sight. Go and secure the perimeter. Make sure no press get in until I've had my press conference. Right you are, sir. Secure the perimeter. Hamish turned and walked out into the biting cold, suppressing a sigh. Blair had his victim, which meant the pressure was off the real killer. It was the perfect conditions for a disposal. If Sheila Bartlett thought the police were satisfied with Gavin, she would feel safe enough to move. But if she remembered Hamish and his orange feather, she would be desperate. Instead of going to the road, Hamish circled the hotel, keeping to the shadows of the tall pine trees that bordered the property. The wind had dropped slightly, leaving a heavy, brooding silence over the glen. The snow was beginning to freeze into a hard crust that crunched loudly underfoot, so Hamish moved carefully, placing his feet in the deep ruts left by the police vehicles. He found a vantage point behind a stack of empty beer kegs near the kitchen entrance, shivering as the cold seeped through his coat. He checked his watch. It was past lunchtime. His stomach gave a traitorous rumble, mourning the venison that was likely now cold and greasy in his oven. He silenced it with a mental promise of a future feast and settled in to wait. He didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, a side door opened, not the main guest entrance, but a fire exit that led from the stairwell of the luxury wing. A figure slipped out, wrapped in a long, dark coat a silk scarf tied tightly over the head to obscure the face. It was Sheila Bartlett. She wasn't carrying a suitcase, she was carrying a heavy plastic shopping bag from a high-end London department store. She stood frozen for a moment, scanning the yard. She looked toward the police cars at the front, then toward the empty expanse of the rear garden. Satisfied that she was unobserved, she began to walk briskly, not toward the road, but toward the loch that lay grey and sullen at the bottom of the hotel grounds. Hamish waited until she was 50 yards away before he moved. He didn't follow directly behind her, the snow would betray him. Instead, he flanked her, moving through the tree line, using the trunks as cover. As he watched her stumbling through the snow in her inappropriate city boots, the pieces of the motive finally clicked into place. It wasn't just about the money Pemberton had stolen from her. It was the humiliation. Pemberton had sat in that sleigh, the lord of the manor, mocking everything around him. She hadn't just killed him, she had turned him into a grotesque ornament in his own celebration. The fairy lights weren't a weapon of convenience, they were a statement. She had decorated him like the Christmas tree he thought he was. She reached the edge of the loch. The water was black and oily, lapping against the wooden pylons of the small boathouse. Sheila stopped at the end of the jetty. She looked around one last time, a desperate, hunted figure against the vast indifference of the landscape. Then she swung the bag back, preparing to hurl it into the depths. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mrs. Bartlett," Hamish called out, his voice carrying clearly over the water. "Plastic doesn't sink well, and the water is clearer than it looks." Sheila spun around, a scream dying in her throat. She clutched the bag to her chest, her eyes wide with terror as Hamish emerged from the trees, looking like a ragged scarecrow brought to life by the winter spirits. "Mr. Macbeth," she gasped, her breath pluming in the air. I was just feeding the fish," Hamish suggested gently, stepping onto the jetty. The wood creaked under his weight. "With a hat? A hat that happens to be missing an orange feather?" He stopped a few feet from her. He could see the bag trembling in her hands. He wasn't armed, and he didn't have handcuffs. All he had was his intuition and the bluff he was about to play. "You see," Hamish continued, his voice soft and conversational, "DCI Blair is very happy with Gavin. He's writing up the papers now. But I'm a curious man, and I'm thinking that bag contains the only thing that can save that lad from prison. And I'm thinking you don't want an innocent boy to pay for your anger, do you? You're not a monster, Mrs. Bartlett. You were just pushed too far." He held out his hand, palm up. The wind whistled through the reeds, a lonely, mournful sound. "Give me the bag, Mrs. Bartlett, before it goes in the water, because if it goes in, I'll have to go in after it, and I really, really hate getting wet on Christmas Day." Sheila Bartlett's grip on the heavy plastic bag slackened, her knuckles fading from a terrified white to a mottled, defeated pink. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the only sound in the frozen air was the slap of the black water against the wooden pylons of the jetty, and the distant, mournful cry of a golden eagle circling the crags above. She looked at Hamish, her eyes searching his face for judgment, and finding only a weary, patient understanding that was far more disarming than any shouted command. With a shudder that seemed to run through her entire frame, she lowered her arm. The bag did not hit the water. Instead, it passed into Hamish's waiting hand with a rustle that sounded unnervingly loud in the silence. Hamish didn't triumph. He didn't smile. He simply opened the bag, shielding the contents from the biting wind with his broad body. Inside, nestled among a tangle of silk scarves, was a brown felt hat. It was an expensive thing, stylish and bold, adorned with a flamboyant array of orange ostrich feathers, except for one conspicuous gap where a feather had been torn away, leaving a jagged stump of glue and thread. Hamish reached into his own pocket, his fingers brushing against the singular orange plume he had retrieved from the snow earlier. The match was perfect. The evidence was complete. He closed the bag and looked down at the woman who was now sinking onto a wooden crate, her face buried in her gloved hands. "It wasn't meant to happen," Sheila sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession she had been carrying across the snowy garden. "I only went to talk to him. I just wanted him to acknowledge what he'd done to me, to admit that he'd ruined my life for sport." Hamish leaned against the railing, placing himself between her and the bitter wind. "But he didn't admit it, did he?" He laughed, she whispered, looking up with tear-streaked cheeks. He was sitting in that ridiculous sleigh, drinking champagne, looking like a king on a throne. When I asked him for help, for just a fraction of what he owed me, he threw his head back and laughed. He called me a sentimental amateur. He said I should be grateful he taught me a lesson in business. She took a ragged breath. The lights were just there, hanging over the side of the sleigh. I didn't think, I just wanted to stop that laugh. I wanted to squeeze it out of him. And so you did, Hamish said softly. It is a terrible thing, rage. It comes like a squall on the loch, fast and blinding, and leaves a wreck behind it. He offered her a handkerchief, which was surprisingly clean given the state of the rest of his uniform. But hiding the hat won't bring him back, and it certainly won't help young Gavin. Gavin? She blinked, confused. The porter, Hamish reminded her. The lad Blair is currently charging with murder, a lad who will spend his life in a cage because you lost your temper. Sheila flinched as if he had struck her. The reality of the collateral damage seemed to pierce her denial in a way the murder itself hadn't. She stood up, unsteady but resolved. I can't let that happen. He's just a boy. No, Hamish agreed. You can't. He gestured toward the path leading back to the hotel. Shall we? The walk back was a somber procession. Hamish carried the bag, the damning evidence swinging rhythmically against his leg, while Sheila walked beside him, her head bowed against the snow that had begun to fall again. They moved through the pine trees, the festive lights of the hotel glowing in the distance like a beacon of warmth that now felt alien and judicial. As they neared the kitchen entrance, the noise of the investigation spilled out. Car doors slamming, radios crackling, and the distinct booming voice of DCI Blair. Hamish paused in the shadow of the building, his mind shifting from the tragedy of the crime to the immediate problem of the solution. He had the killer, he had the weapon's missing piece. But if he simply marched Sheila into the lobby and presented her to Blair, two things would happen. Blair would be humiliated, which made him dangerous, and Hamish would be hailed as a hero. Heroism led to commendations, and commendations led to promotion. Promotion meant a transfer to Strathbane, to a desk, to a life of paperwork and city pavements, far away from his stove, his mountains, and his freedom. He looked at Sheila. She was resigned, waiting for the handcuffs. She expected the full force of the law. What she didn't expect was Hamish Macbeth's survival instinct. "Listen to me," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We are going to go in through the front. You are going to walk up to the desk, but you are not going to say I caught you." "I don't understand," she stammered. "You are going to say you couldn't live with the guilt," Hamish instructed, his eyes gleaming with a sudden sharp intelligence. "You saw the police were arresting the wrong man, and your conscience broke. You are surrendering to the chief inspector because his relentless pressure on the hotel guests forced you to come forward. Do you understand? It was Blair's pressure that cracked you, not my mooching." Sheila looked at him, bewildered by this strange, scruffy policeman, who seemed more concerned with avoiding credit than taking it. "You want me to lie? I want you to tell the truth about the murder," Hamish corrected. "But the catching, well, let's just say DCI Blair needs a win if I'm to get any peace this Christmas. You surrender to him. I was just the escort who showed you the way." He adjusted his cap, checked that the orange feather was deep in his pocket, and handed her the bag. "Hold this. Chin up, Mrs. Bartlett. It's time to face the music. And remember, Blair is the genius here. I'm just the local scenery." With a deep breath, Hamish pushed open the heavy front doors, ushering the murderer into the warmth, ready to deliver the performance of his life. The sudden transition from the biting, monochromatic world of the winter garden to the stifling technicolor warmth of the hotel lobby was disorienting. The air inside was thick, a suffocating soup of pine needles, floor wax, and the acrid metallic scent of high-tension policing. To Hamish Macbeth, whose senses had been sharpened by the clean cold of the loch, the noise was a physical assault. The murmur of the guests, who had been corralled into the lounge but were spilling out like water from a leaking dam, mixed with the crackle of radios and the heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots on the parquet floor. At the centre of this sensory storm stood Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man who seemed to generate his own gravity of unpleasantness. He was currently leaning over the reception desk, his face mere inches from Gavin's terror-stricken visage. The young porter was dissolving, his tears leaving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks, while Detective Anderson stood by, scribbling in a notebook with the detached efficiency of a mortician measuring a coffin. "We have the champagne bottle, you little cretin," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the high cornice ceiling. "We have your fingerprints on the neck. You went in to steal, he woke up, you panicked, and you strangled him. Confess, and I might ask the judge for leniency. Keep lying, and you'll rot in Barlinnie until you're old and grey." "I didn't. I only took the bottle," Gavin wailed, a sound of pure helpless despair that made Hamish's jaw tighten. Hamish stepped forward, his boots squeaking loudly on the polished wood. He nudged Sheila Bartlett gently with his elbow, a silent cue that the curtain had risen on their grim little play. She moved with the stiffness of a marionette, clutching the plastic bag to her chest as if it were a shield. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said, his voice pitching into the slow, hesitant drawl he reserved for his most irritating performances. "Sorry to interrupt your interrogation." Blair spun around, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. "Macbeth, I told you to secure the perimeter. What are you doing in here? And who is this?" Hamish removed his cap, twisting it in his large red hands. "Well, sir, I was patrolling the grounds just as you ordered, being vigilant, and I found this lady wandering near the loch. She seemed distressed, sir, distressed by the sheer scale of your operation." Blair blinked, his small eyes darting from Hamish to Sheila. "Distressed? Who is she?" "I am Sheila Bartlett," she said. Her voice was quiet, trembling, but it carried a steel thread of resolve that cut through the lobby's noise. She stepped past Hamish, walking toward the desk with a dignity that silenced the room. The guests in the doorway stopped whispering. Anderson stopped writing. Even Blair seemed to deflate slightly, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure. "Bartlett?" Blair frowned. "The business partner? We checked you out. You were in your room." "I wasn't," she said. She lifted the heavy shopping bag and placed it on the counter between them. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. With shaking hands, she reached in and pulled out the brown felt hat. The gap in the feathers where the orange plume had been torn away seemed to scream in the silence. "I was in the garden. I was in the sleigh." Blair looked at the hat, then at Gavin, and finally back at the woman. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The narrative he had constructed, the simple, violent robbery by a local Ned, was disintegrating before his eyes, and the confusion on his face was absolute. "I don't understand," Blair muttered. "The boy, the champagne." "The boy is innocent," Sheila said, turning to look at Gavin, who was staring at her with wide, wet eyes. "He took the bottle, yes, but Marcus was already dead. I killed him. I strangled him with the lights because he laughed at me. Because he took everything I had and treated it like a joke." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and dangerous. Blair was losing control. He looked furious, not at the murder, but at the fact that his solution was wrong. He turned his glare on Hamish, ready to accuse him of interfering, of ruining the case. Hamish saw the danger instantly. He stepped in, his voice oozing sycophancy. "It was the pressure, Sir Hamish," said quickly, nodding sagely at Blair. "She told me outside. She saw your men swarming the hotel. She heard you commanding the operation from the lobby. She knew there was no escape. She said, 'That chief inspector has closed the net. He knows everything.' She was terrified of your psychological tactics, sir. She knew you were just waiting for her to crack." Hamish paused, watching Blair's face. The purple hue of rage was slowly fading, replaced by a dawning realization that he was being offered a lifeline, a golden, ego-stroking lifeline. "She said that?" Blair asked, straightening his tie. "Oh, aye, sir," Hamish lied, his face a picture of rustic admiration. "She said she'd never seen a police force move with such terrifying efficiency. She was trying to dispose of the hat in the loch, but she knew you'd have divers down there within the hour. It was your reputation that caught her, sir. I just walked her in." Blair puffed out his chest. The narrative rewrote itself in his mind instantly. He wasn't the man who had bullied an innocent boy, he was the master tactician whose overwhelming presence had forced a killer to surrender. "Well," Blair huffed, shooting his cuffs, "I suspected as much. I knew the boy was a weak link, likely just a witness. I was pressing him to flush out the real culprit. Standard procedure, Macbeth. Something you'd know if you did real police work." He turned to Anderson, barking with renewed authority. "Anderson! Caution Mrs. Bartlett. Bag that hat and release the boy. Give him a caution for theft, but get him out of my sight." As Anderson moved to handcuff Sheila, she looked over her shoulder at Hamish. Her eyes were sad, filled with the grief of a ruined life, but there was a flicker of gratitude there too. She understood the game. She had traded her freedom for the boys, and Hamish had traded the credit for his peace. "Good work, sir," Hamish murmured, putting his cap back on. "A masterclass. Yes, well, try to learn from it." "Macbeth," Blair sneered, watching his prisoner being led away. "Now go and make me a cup of tea, and try not to drop it. You look like you've been sleeping in a ditch." Hamish turned away, hiding the small, triumphant smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. He was hungry, he was tired, and he was being insulted by a fool. It was, he decided, the perfect ending to a Lochdubh Christmas. The commotion in the Lochdubh Hotel dissolved with the rapid, disorganized efficiency characteristic of DCI Blair's team. Once the prisoner was secured and the statement taken, a process that involved Blair shouting questions at Sheila Bartlett while she sat in dignified silence, the caravan prepared to move. The lobby, previously a theatre of high drama, was left strewn with muddy boot prints and the lingering echo of accusations. The festive atmosphere thoroughly popped like a cheap balloon. Hamish stood by the heavy front doors, holding them open against the gale, letting the freezing wind serve as a final usher for his colleagues. Blair swept past him, buttoning his coat over his paunch with the swagger of a man who had personally wrestled a dragon and won. He paused on the top step to light a cigarette, shielding the flame with hands that shook slightly from the adrenaline of his own self-importance. "You got lucky, Macbeth," Blair grunted, exhaling a cloud of smoke that mingled with the spindrift. "If I hadn't put the fear of God into that woman with my psychological profiling, we'd be dragging the lock for weeks. Next time, try to show a bit of initiative. You stood around like a spare part at a wedding. I will try to emulate your dynamism in the future, sir," Hamish said, his face a mask of earnest stupidity, his voice void of any sarcasm that Blair could detect. "Safe journey back. The roads are treacherous over the pass." "I know how to drive, man," Blair snapped, stung by the implication that he couldn't handle a bit of Highland weather. He climbed into the passenger seat of the lead car, barking at Anderson to put his foot down because he had a press conference to prepare for. The convoy roared away, sirens blaring unnecessarily once more, slicing through the quiet village afternoon as they headed south towards Strathbane to feed the media the story of the brilliant detective who cracked the Christmas case. Hamish watched the red taillights disappear around the bend of the Loch Road. As the sound of the engines faded, replaced by the soft whisper of the falling snow and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the harbour wall, he felt a physical weight lift from his shoulders. The tension that had coiled in his gut since the phone rang that morning unspooled, leaving behind only a profound, hollow exhaustion and a ravenous hunger that felt capable of consuming the furniture. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the wind. Lugs, who had been hiding in the scullery eating scraps from the sympathetic commis chef, trotted out into the yard, looking fat, greasy, and entirely unapologetic. "You are a disgrace to the force," Hamish told the dog affectionately, scratching him behind the ears. "You missed the arrest. But you probably had a better lunch than I did. Come on. Let's see if there is anything left of Christmas to salvage." The walk back to the police station was slow and deliberately aimless. The village was no longer empty, the curtains of the cottages were twitching, and faces appeared at windows. The Highland Telegraph, that invisible network of gossip that moved faster than fibre optics, had already disseminated the news. They knew the Englishman was dead, they knew the fancy woman had been taken away, and despite the official police statement that would appear in tomorrow's papers praising DCI Blair's deductive genius, the people of Lochdubh knew exactly who had solved the crime. As Hamish passed the grocer's shop, Mrs. Macrum tapped on the window and gave him a thumbs up, mouthing something that looked suspiciously like free shortbread. From the doorway of the curry shop, Patel waved a ladle. Hamish acknowledged them with a barely perceptible nod, sinking his chin deeper into his collar. He didn't want praise. Praise was dangerous. Praise attracted attention from headquarters, and attention led to expectations, which inevitably led to real work. He just wanted his dinner. He reached the police station and let himself in, the familiar smell of soot, old coffee and dog hair greeting him like an old friend. The fire in the pot-bellied stove had burned down to embers, but the room was still retaining a stubborn warmth. The smell of the venison, however, had changed. It was no longer the rich, gamey aroma of a feast, it was the acrid, carbonized scent of a culinary disaster. Hamish approached the oven with the trepidation of a bomb disposal expert. He opened the door and peered inside. The joint was dark, very dark. It had shrunk considerably, withdrawing into itself as if in protest. And the juices in the pan had reduced to a black sticky tar that looked like it could pave the A9. "Well, lugs," Hamish sighed, prodding the roast with a fork. It was tough, resistant and dry, but not completely rock-hard. "It seems we are having jerky for Christmas dinner. But it is hot, and it is ours." He carved the meat, salvaging the inner slices which were merely chewy rather than incinerated. He opened a tin of peas, boiled some potatoes on the top of the stove, and drowned the whole plate in a thick gravy made from a packet, having decided the pan juices were likely carcinogenic. It was a humble meal, eaten at a small wooden table while the wind rattled the window panes. But to Hamish, it tasted like victory. He poured himself a large glass of the whiskey he had been saving, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight. He sat back in his battered armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the revived fire, the plate balanced on his knees. Lugg sat at his feet, chewing contentedly on a piece of burnt venison rind, his tail thumping a lazy rhythm on the rug. The phone remained silent. The radio was off. The murder was solved, the killer was in custody, and the innocent were free. More importantly, Hamish Macbeth was still just a village bobby. He hadn't been promoted, he hadn't been transferred to the grime of Glasgow or the bureaucracy of Strathbane. He was still here, in his own small kingdom of mountains and water, where the crimes were personal, the tea was always hot, and the authorities thought he was a fool. He took a sip of the whiskey, feeling the burn settle comfortably in his chest. He thought briefly of Sheila Bartlett, sitting in a cold cell in Strathbane, and felt a moment of pity. She had let the world of ambition and money twist her until she snapped. Hamish looked around his shabby, comfortable room. He had no money to speak of, his uniform was frayed, and his dinner was burnt, but he had his freedom. "Merry Christmas, Lugs," Hamish murmured, closing his eyes as the warmth of the fire washed over him. The dog let out a long, satisfied snore. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the footprints in the hotel garden, covering the evidence of the day's violence, and sealing Lochdubh once again in its beautiful, deceptive peace. The lazy policeman was back on duty, which meant, of course, that he was fast asleep. Boxing Day arrived in Lochdubh with a brilliance that made the eyes ache. The grey, suffocating clouds of Christmas had been swept away by the gale, leaving behind a sky of piercing, innocent blue and sunlight that bounced blindingly off the snow-covered mountains. It was the sort of day that tourists paid thousands of pounds to see, usually in August when it was raining, but for the locals, it was simply a signal that the roads might finally be passable. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was engaged in critical police business. He was standing on the pier, ostensibly checking the structural integrity of the crab pots, but in reality, he was watching the sunlight glint on the water and digesting a second breakfast of black pudding rolls provided by the grateful proprietor of the curry shop. Luggs was busy investigating a piece of dried kelp with the intensity of a forensic scientist. The sound of a Land Rover crunching over the packed snow made Hamish turn. It was a familiar vehicle, dark green and muddy, belonging to the Halberton Smythes. Hamish felt the familiar, uncomfortable flutter in his chest. He straightened his tunic, brushed a few crumbs of black pudding from his lapel, and waited as Priscilla hopped out. She was wearing a thick sheepskin coat and Wellington boots, yet she still managed to look as if she had just stepped out of a fashion shoot for country life. She carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Morning, Hamish," she called out, her breath misting in the crisp air. "I come bearing gifts." Daddy had far too much goose yesterday, and the cook threatened to quit if she had to make one more curry with the leftovers. "I am always happy to assist the community in waste disposal," Hamish said solemnly, accepting the heavy basket. He peeked inside, roast goose, stuffing, cranberry sauce and, glory be, a bottle of decent claret. "Your father is a generous man, even if he doesn't know it." Priscilla leaned against the railing beside him, looking out over the loch. "I saw the papers this morning, Hamish. The Eagle of the North swoops again. DCI Blair is being hailed as the modern Sherlock Holmes." Hamish chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Aye, well, he has the profile for it, and the volume." The article says he used advanced psychological pressure techniques to force a confession, Priscilla noted, a wry smile playing on her lips. I assume that translates to you finding the evidence and handing it to him on a silver platter so he wouldn't fire you? I merely pointed Mrs. Bartlett in the right direction, Hamish demurred, tearing off a piece of bread from the basket and tossing it to a waiting seagull. She was a desperate woman, Priscilla. Pemberton had broken her. Prison will be hard, but I think she felt lighter the moment she put that hat on the counter. The secret was heavier than the sentence will be. Priscilla sighed, her expression turning serious. It's a tragedy, really, but there is a silver lining. I heard from London this morning. With Pemberton dead and his assets frozen for the murder investigation, the sale of the Glencera estate has fallen through. Hamish froze. Has it now? It has. The executors are looking for a quick liquidation. The Community Trust is putting in a bid. It looks like the hills won't be covered in timeshare chalets after all. Mrs. MacGregor's land will stay with the locals. Hamish looked up at the mountains, white and jagged against the blue sky. The threat of the Sassenach invasion had receded, washed away by the tide of the investigation. The village was safe. His world was safe. That is good news, Hamish said softly. It is, Priscilla agreed. She turned to him, her blue eyes searching his face. You know, Hamish, anyone else would be shouting from the rooftops about solving a murder like this. You could be a detective inspector by now. You could be in Inverness. You could make something of yourself. Hamish looked at her, beautiful, ambitious, and belonging to a world of ambition and drive that he simply didn't understand. Then he looked at Lugs, currently rolling happily in a patch of snow. He looked at the basket of food that would last him 3 days. He felt the cold, clean air in his lungs and the silence of the glen that was not empty, but full of peace. I have made something of myself, Priscilla, Hamish said gently. I am the village Bobby, and the view from my office is better than any in Inverness. Priscilla watched him for a long moment, the tension between them hanging in the air like wood smoke. Then she smiled, a genuine, slightly sad smile that acknowledged the unbridgeable gap between them. I suppose it is, Hamish. I suppose it is. She patted his arm, her gloved hand resting there for a second longer than necessary. Enjoy the goose, and try to stay out of trouble until New Year. I make no promises, Hamish replied. He watched her drive away, the Land Rover disappearing around the curve of the bay. When she was gone, he picked up the basket and whistled for Lugs. Come on, you useless beast, Hamish said, heading back toward the warmth of the police station stove. We have a bottle of claret to inspect, and I believe there is a very important nap scheduled for this afternoon. Lugs barked, a sound of pure agreement, and trotted after him. The murder was solved, the dead were at peace, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be. Home.